The theaters of war, war on land. Strategists in Britain, France, and Germany had all written about the need for rapid morale mobile attacks based on large numbers of tanks, but it was German leadership that put these theories into practice. The result was Blitzkrieg. Now, instead of the defensive war of World War I, there was an offensive war that consisted of surprise, speed, and movement using tanks, armored vehicles, mechanized transport, and the airplane. An airstrike took out the opposing air force and communication centers on the ground, and parachuters were dropped behind enemy lines. The swift-moving tanks and motorized infantry, supported by air power, would then split the enemy lines and allow rapid penetration into the unprotected territories beyond, with the aim of encircling the main enemy forces and destroying them. Thus, a rapid, decisive victory was achieved. Blitzkrieg allowed German tectonic quick victories that were not too damning in terms of casualties and resources. The speed and surprise elements of Germany's successes prevented other countries from mobilizing fully for total war and had a devastating impact on morale. The war at sea. For Britain, naval powers was critical for maintaining the vital trade routes on which the British population depended for its survival. It also allowed Britain to defend its empire that was essential to an army operation outside home waters. Thus, until 1944, Britain fought mainly a naval war. Yet even more so than in 1914 and 1918, sea warfare in the Atlantic was no longer about battles between large fleets of huge battleships. Sea warfare was now about controlling supply lines, and from 1940 to 1943, Britain and Germany fought to see who could dominate the Atlantic. Although the German U-boat fleet was a small fleet in 1939, it was developed quickly. Hitler needed the U-boats to keep Britain and the USA occupied while Germany was tied up with the Soviet Union. There was also a possible way of defeating the British outright, and at first the German U-boats were very successful at harrying British lifeline. In 1941, submarines sank 1,299 ships, and in 1942, 1,662 ships. To combat the U-boats, the Allies had both to avoid them and attack them. Both strategies depended on precise knowledge of the opposition and movement of the U-boats. By the end of 1943, it was clear that the Allies had won the battle for the Atlantic. Richard Overy appointed points to the importance of the British and American willingness to recognize and undertake a revolution in maritime strategy, something that the Germans were reluctant to do. War in the air. Both sides used aircrafts as a tactical support for armies on the ground. Radio communication was used to coordinate air support with ground attack aircraft attacking enemy strongpoints, supply lines, troops, and vehicles. In supply and reconnaissance, aircrafts were also applied to great effect with supplies and now were dropped by aircraft. Camera technology was greatly improved throughout the course of the war, making photo reconnaissance aircrafts even more effective. World War II also saw an even more radical and independent use for aircraft strategic bombing. This type of bombing focused on destroying the military and industrial infrastructure of a country. It could also, however, be directed against civilians in an attempt to crush civilian morale. Apart from retaliation for the Blitz, the switch to area bombing by the British and Americans was also caused by the fact that precision attacks on German industrial targets in daylight led to high casualties, and localized nighttime attacks were too inaccurate. In addition, the revolutionary effect of aircraft and sea warfare was demonstrated even more clearly in the war with Japan. Japan used air power highly effectively at the start of the war with the attack on Pearl Harbor, and also against the British and Dutch ships in the Pacific. Like Germany, Japan hoped to intercept Allied shipping shipping supplies to prevent any reinforcements reaching the Pacific. It also hoped to destroy the rest of the U.S. fleet. The role of civilians. Mobilization of human resources. As with World War I, civilians were mobilized in all countries to help with the war effort. This effort was, however, on a much vaster scale than World War I. The necessary amount of war materials was vast, and countries used different methods to get the workforce that they required. In Germany, there was little change to the economy at the beginning of the war, as the early victories did not push much strain on the home front. The labor force was substantially increased, however, by workers from the countries that the Germans had occupied. These workers were forcibly brought to Germany, and by September 1944, there were 7,487,000 foreigners in Germany, and this constituted 21% of the workforce. In America, women also played a key role in industries doing semi-skilled jobs such as crane operation, tool making, shell loading, aircraft making, and lumberjacking. An estimated 350,000 women also joined uniformed groups. As in Germany, the Japanese government was reluctant to use the women in the workforce, preferring to use conscript students rather than women, though more than 2.5 million extra women did enter the workforce between 1940 and 1945. The acts of genocide. Hitler and Germany believed that certain races, in particular Jews, but also Slavs, were subhuman. The space that was necessary for the greater German Reich also meant that the existing populations in Poland and the USSR had to be destroyed or displaced. The Jews, the special SS squads called the Einsatzgruppen, accompanied the German army as it invaded Poland, and they had a dedicated job of killing all Jews. Communist locals and resistors they encountered. By the end of July 1941, the Einsatzgruppen had murdered around 63,000 men, women, and children, 90% of whom were Jews. The Nazis came up with a new method to deliver their quote-unquote final solution to the Jewish question. The transportation of Jews from across Europe for a concentration of extermination camps where they could be eliminated either by poison gas or through overwork and starvation. The Japanese also had ambitions linked to racial superiority. The Chinese people, wrote General Sakai Rao, the chief of the Japanese forces in North China in 1937, said, "Are bacteria infesting world civilization?" Such attitudes were commonplace. Hence the genocidal Japanese treatment of the Chinese in the rape of Nia Hang. Deportations. The Soviet government also deported whole populations. It assumed that the minority peoples in the West were disloyal to the Soviet Union, and thus the Germans on the Volga and the Tatars in the Suriname were deported. Estonians, Lithuanians, and Poles were all sent to Siberia or other parts of the USSR. The growth of governmental power in the Soviet Union. In the Soviet Union, this centralized, all-powerful state already existed. Its survival after 1941 was turned into Stalin's, quote, single war camp, where war production was the only priority. A single national war plan was drawn up in 1943, and the planners were given the powers for getting their objectives completed. The military share of the budget rose from 29 to 57%, and unlike in Germany, Soviet planners concentrated on large groups of weapons to be produced as simply, quickly, and as possible. Growth of governmental power in the USA. In the USA, the government also took control of industrial production. The War Production Board, which was established in 1942, changed production priorities to the needs of the military. Thus, car factories now produce tanks and planes. The War Commission recruited workers for where they were needed most, and new industries were created, particularly for the production of synthetic materials. However, the USA mainly relied on American business with its expertise in mass production and technical innovation, and it granted contracts out to the big industries to produce what was needed. So, answering the question that was asked in the beginning, World War II can be considered a total war in similar elements of World War I in the industry and development of countries, new ways in how to fight, and the use of these war machines, but the production of these machines is the total effort from the countries. Nations allowing new and involved peoples to be able to work and produce in such efforts such as industry, finance, and labor. Most importantly, involved world superpowers and was affected by smaller, more supporting countries involving all peoples. Armies fighting against each other on the battlefield, races being deported, and horrendous acts of genocide all being composed into one war involving the world with history-altering events, all with support from everyone within their own country.